So welcome everyone to this webinar, Cultivating a Culture of Diversity and Inclusion, a deep dive for senior leaders. Myself and Josephine are delighted to be with you today and extend a huge welcome to you wherever you are in the world. As I said, do write in the chat, let us know where you're from. For those of you who don't know Ashridge Hult, Ashridge is part of the world's largest private education company, along with EF, Education First. EF focuses on language training for all ages, cultural exchange, educational travel, and the International Business School of Hult. Ashridge is part of that company, a triple accredited leading international business school. We've got 60 years of experience delivering executive education and campuses across the US, Dubai, the UK and Hong Kong. So we've got and have invested in developing our expertise in diversity and inclusion, and are looking forward to being with you today. So my name's Debbie. I'm Professor of OD and Change at Ashridge. I've been there for 7 years and I'm passionate about working with organisations to build diverse workforces and co-create inclusive cultures. I've recently completed my own doctoral research looking at the impact of gender on everyday workplace conversation, and particularly how women experience being silenced. Interestingly, inclusion doesn't happen until everyone's able to contribute and have their contributions valued. So my research highlighted the complexity of actually achieving that in the workplace. Josephine.
Hi, my name is Josephine Bithi, Dr. Josephine Bithi, because I just also recently completed my research. My work was on wholeness and bringing the whole self to the workplace and what that is like for someone like myself who is Kenyan, born, bred, and yearning to work in an international organization, and what that feels like, and the lessons we pick out of that as we try to create inclusive workplaces. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I like to call myself a storyteller. So let's have a conversation and let's tell some stories around diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Over to you, Debbie.
So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to explore with you some of the personal challenges leaders are facing at the moment and how to overcome them. We're going to mention what good organisation leaders are doing to build inclusive organisations that are anti-racist, and also explore the changing role of HR in supporting the leadership journey to inclusion. And as we go through, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A box that you can access via the menu bar at the bottom of the screen. So we want to just start by acknowledging the extraordinary pressure many of you are under right now. On the one hand, you're operating in complexity, ambiguity, and more recently, crisis. You're expected to make decisions, rapid decisions, often with incomplete and rapidly evolving information. And on the other hand, the diversity imperative is compelling you to prioritise this cultural shift to inclusive organisations. So it's no mean feat. We're becoming increasingly aware that the context of leadership is in a society that's systemically racist and where many other isms also persist. And this has been brought to the forefront, as you will all know, with recent events. And however well-meaning and intentional leaders are in times such as the current crisis of today, it's easy to fall into patterns of bias and exclusion. We all do it. When we're stressed, tired, or overloaded with emotion, we often default to mental shortcuts and our gut instincts, rather than making deliberate decisions rational, thought through decisions. We also know that right now, more than ever, inclusion is critical to keeping employees engaged. We're also trying to develop collaboration amongst teams and make organisations more innovative. And this slide shows that companies with more diverse leadership teams report higher innovation revenue. So companies with below average diversity scores, 26% average innovation revenue is reported. And companies with above average diversity scores report 45% innovation revenue. And the business case for diversity is well known now. We know that there are many, many advantages. But this all depends on inclusive leadership. And increasingly, customers and employees expect companies and their leaders to stand for more than just the bottom line. There's more emphasis on social advocacy, commitments to equality and diversity, and giving back, socially giving back. And these factors are now defining what makes a successful company. These expectations are evolving rapidly, and the companies that are leading with their values, creating more social impact, and actively working to make their cultures more diverse and inclusive are seeing better customer loyalty, as well as improving their employee engagement and productivity. So there's no reason to delay this any longer. The key to it all is inclusive leadership. And what we mean by that is leaders who act intentionally to create an inclusive culture within their sphere of responsibility and are prepared to tackle the systemic challenges around workplace equality. So it's a massive task. Our view is that inclusive leadership is complex. You can't simply throw a mix of people together. It doesn't guarantee performance, innovation, or growth. We need intentionality and hard work to make this happen. And hopefully we're going to give you some insights around that today. So now it's a pivotal time for leaders to think about what type of leader they want to be, how they want to be experienced in the workplace, and what's the story they want their workers to tell, especially the more vulnerable and marginalised ones. So in our discussion today, we want to encourage you to prioritise inclusive behaviours and offer you some specific insights and strategies for building those inclusive cultures in your organisations. We've learned through our own research how creating inclusive environments is more complicated and challenging than we realise. And today, Josephine and I want to encourage you to prioritise your personal journey towards inclusivity. Josephine.
Yeah, it's also an important time to think as HR practitioners. I forgot to mention that I've been in HR for almost 30 years. And so HR practitioners have a really critical role to play in this space in the organizations. It's important for HR practitioners to start to engage more purposefully and to challenge leaders. How do they want to lead? How do they want to support diversity and inclusion in the organization? How critical do we want to be as HR practitioners about the practices, the policies, the staff rules that we have that in a way other certain groups of people in the organization? And more importantly, given that we are typically a governance function, a support function, how can we as HR practitioners do this without being put to the side, ignored because we're making unnecessary noises that are uncomfortable to the leadership of the organization. So, and as I'm sure I have leaders on this call, how do you interact with your HR practitioner and together build this type of organization? This is some of the stuff that we're going to be discussing today.
So Josephine, what have you learned as an HR practitioner about how organizations are living the dilemma of diversity and inclusion, particularly race? What are the key messages?
Well, this year has been tough, you know, it's been tough for many leaders. I'm based in New York, so we were all handling COVID and the pandemic and trying to make sure that people are safe, that productivity continues. And then boom, we have to discuss and we have to handle and we have to talk about some difficult topics like Black Lives Matter. And most HR leaders are struggling with this conversation. And I, for example, have been working with groups that have had to tackle this particular conversation for their organizations. Do Black Lives Matter? And how do you have these conversations? And what we've been finding as we discuss this is that they're difficult conversations. Managers don't know how to have them. Staff don't know how to ask questions. Many people don't feel that they can trust the organizations to actually have a real candid and open conversation about race because it's not something that we really talk about. And so some organizations have moved to focusing on numbers, you know, so because if we do a survey, perhaps, we're able to set a baseline, we're able to establish what it is that we're trying to work on, and then after that, move ahead. But even in putting together a survey, there have been lots of questions. In the UK, for example, we have this category BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. Some people say, yes, let's respond to our surveys with those types of categories. Others say, I don't want to respond to a survey with those types of categories because they don't represent who I am. So organizations are struggling. Do we ask people to voluntarily self-identify race, disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation? Or do we ask people to, do we force it? Do we say you must identify yourself? Do we ask questions where we're saying, have you had an experience with racism? Some organizations have found when they ask that question, the groups that they're asking of get really offended because they're saying it's very obvious that I've experienced othering. Let's call it more broadly. Some organizations are asking around, you know, representation. You know, what categories do we use? And the question around categories is very challenging as well. What categories do you use? And I would like to suggest that really at the end of the day, it's about belonging. It's about having a voice. It's about who has power, who doesn't have power. And as organizations start to tackle this, taking it from the perspective of trying to understand from the bottom up, from the top down, multiple conversations, let's just simply talk about it. Who feels they belong, who is able to bring their whole self to work and who is not, and how do we as an organization make this possible for everyone? I hope I've answered your question, but this is the perspective that I would take. But let me ask you, Debbie, though, many leaders are recognizing that the power they have as role models and are striving to be inclusive themselves. What are some of the challenges, the personal challenges you think they're facing? And what tips do you have for them to overcome some of these challenges?
Okay, well, I think the challenges are numerous, but I'm going to talk about three. And I wonder if the first challenge is understanding what inclusive leadership really means. For me, it's not just about including people in conversations or in meetings or in decision making. It doesn't mean involving everyone in everything, nor does it mean including difference for the sake of it. It means including the right people at the right time and then creating the conditions for good conversation and transparent decision making. And it's also, for me, about valuing and seeking out and leveraging differences. And that's a whole new set of skills for leaders and managers. And I think we're all on that journey. An inclusive leader has to be open-minded and a great listener, a really active listener, and is able to create that atmosphere of trust for people to speak up, that psychological safety that we talk about these days, so that, yeah, people feel free to speak up and they feel valued in their contributions. These are essential skills for leaders who need to leverage the differences diversity brings, because it's not until we can really hold those different views and opinions in a situation. It's not until we can do that that we actually manage to get something new from the conversation, to get the creativity that diversity brings. So it's about holding polarities, different people's views and perspectives that can be listened to, heard, and eventually something new might emerge. At Ashridge, we've developed 7 competencies for inclusive leaders. Sorry, I'm not going to go through these, but you will see there that these are, some fairly new, some of them, new competencies around working with people. They're relational competencies in the workplace. And whilst leadership in general is moving towards a more relational perspective, inclusive leadership absolutely requires it. So the key is to be self-aware enough to know when you might need help to develop a particular skill or set of skills, courageous enough to seek feedback and show your vulnerability, and savvy enough to know that whatever you do will be setting standards for other people. Josephine talked about that role model. It's about understanding your power as a role model. It's like enthusiasm being infectious. If you demonstrate inclusivity, you will infect inclusivity in other people. So the second challenge that I want to talk about is, again, a personal one. And it's really about coming to terms with our own personal biases and also the collective bias in organizations and managing them intentionally. Biases, as we know, are inclinations or prejudices against one person or a group of people, especially in a way that's considered to be negative or unfair. We all have them. They affect our attitudes, our behaviours towards people, and our decision making. And we don't even realise it's happening a lot of the time. While some biases may be conscious to us, others reveal themselves, and we have to learn to notice them. For example, I recently realised that I have a bias towards people who demonstrate resilience. My daughter-in-law came home from work and she went to bed because she'd lost her voice, she'd got laryngitis. And I noticed myself thinking, she's a bit flaky. And I started making judgments about her. And I started having negative thoughts. And I had to quickly manage my bias to show her the empathy and care she deserved. She wasn't being flaky, she was unwell, but I really had to catch myself in that moment. Have any of you been in a situation where you've gone to see a professional, maybe a doctor or a surgeon or a dentist, and you've been confronted with somebody that doesn't fit your perception of what that professional might look like? I think it's happened to many of us. And those are the sorts of things that we have to learn to catch ourselves in the moment. So learning to notice our human biases is one thing, and then making the choice, because it is a choice, to manage them and change our thoughts and our behaviours towards other people is another. And even though we can notice some of our biases, there are others that are outside our consciousness that we're literally unaware of. So being open to and actually asking for feedback as a leader is imperative. We can learn more about the biases that we have. So you might ask, how do we manage bias in the workplace? The first step is to identify and educate people about the types of bias that are likely to be prevalent. And scientists have, they've found about 150 known biases. And biases can affect all aspects of the employee cycle. There are some here on this slide. I'm not going to go into explaining them, but some of them you will know about, some of them you may not. And these are common biases. And each bias has defining features and also strategies that we can use to mitigate it. And so in organizations, we have to look at these biases and look at each one and think, how can that affect each aspect of the employee cycle? So we're talking about attracting people, interviewing people, recruiting, how we manage people, how we develop them, how we promote them, how we reward them, how we induct them. That's what I mean by the employee cycle. Everything that happens to the employee can be affected by bias. And we need to understand that and minimize it, if not eradicate it completely. So we can put strategies in place to make more effective decisions. It can be very difficult to manage bias in the moment you're making a decision. So as leaders, we need to create spaces where we can design practices and processes in advance. For example, recruitment practices, and consciously identify particular situations where more deliberate thought and strategies would be helpful. And then set up the necessary conversations to do that. So the third challenge that I want to talk about is to make the journey from diversity critic to diversity learner. And again, you know, I think these three things are key to starting, if not progressing, your journey as leaders to be more inclusive. So this third one, making the journey from diversity critic to diversity learner. This means to develop diverse intelligences. For example, getting to know different cultures, different religions, genders, disabilities, getting to know how people who are different to you experience the workplace and life in general. It's about being curious about people who are different to you. Because when we connect with people on a human level, when we get to know people, we can connect with them more on a human level. And when we do that, we treat them differently. So there are some tips for making a start with this developing diverse intelligence. And the first one is being curious and interested in learning about others who are different. And really cultivating that curiosity. The other is developing an awareness of self in relation to others. Understanding the impact you have and how your biases may be affecting your relationship with others. We've also got to make our minds a clean slate. So it's stopping those judgments from happening, catching ourselves in the moment, trying to really have an open mind about people until we know them really well. And demonstrating humility, being able to say, I don't know what it's like to be Black, tell me. And finding ways to open up those conversations in the workplace can make people feel so much more psychologically safe in their working context. Developing an awareness of your biases towards other cultures and traditions we've talked about, and putting yourself in situations with people from different cultures, backgrounds, generations, gender, etc., is a good way to start noticing your bias and also to get to know difference. And then there's also the other things like watching watching films, watching programs, reading, observing, reflecting. And then lastly, acting with intent, doing all of the above intentionally, because it's like anything, we don't learn about something in depth unless we do it with intention. And that's what we need to do. So these are 3 steps to getting on the journey to inclusivity. But leaders also need to build understanding of the current context of organizations. So Josephine, what are your views as a Kenyan woman on racism in the workplace?
So perhaps let me start off, with a story. And I've just seen a question set out by someone saying, I live in a rural area where we don't have a lot of diversity. And so how do I get exposed to this kind of diversity? I grew up in the city in Nairobi, and as was customary, every holiday when schools were closed, we went back to the village, which is what we call home. The city is almost like just a house where you live in, but the village is where your relatives are and your family is, and where you learn some of life's hardest lessons. And in this living there, I learned how to live in multiple worlds. One side you had television, electricity, running water, we spoke good English. And the other side, we had to learn our mother tongue, and we learned how to milk, and we learned how to live with nature, and sort of like learning how to live in both worlds has been a competence that many people my age group have developed. So I grew up, with the stories of home and the stories of family, and the stories of women around me who sort of really upheld who they thought I was, teaching me lessons, how to be the matriarch, how to be a leader, how to survive, how to be able to fend for myself, how to be wise. And many people, many young people, education has always been the biggest thing that was required, and so we studied, and we all aspired to be modern and to be civilized, and to have some of the best things that that life can offer, and for some reason, that civilization, that modernity, that goodness was described as going to the West, going to America. And it's interesting, when I came to America, I learned, and I want to use that phrase, I learned that I was Black. So I came to the US when I was about 26 years old. So for 26 years of my life, I was just Josephine. Daughter of so-and-so, big sister to so-and-so, good at this and bad at the other, but simply just a young woman. When I came to the US, I learned that I was Black. And this is why I say it's important to develop a level of awareness about what some of these categories mean to different people. So learning that I was Black, I needed to then ask, but what does that mean? My parents lived in colonized Kenya, and then we had independence. So I was wondering, is that what it means? And quickly I learned that actually it means that you are perhaps not as privileged, you perhaps have certain quirkiness about you, and the things that you see and you experience as you walk into an organization. Recall I've told you that I was raised by strong women, so they taught me how to be a leader. So coming into organizations, I find that they're not, we're teaching women how to be leaders because they don't have leadership qualities. At least that is the thinking behind it. And so I raise this story because there's so many categories that we have all created that we sort of live in and work through that build up and build up these biases. And you then, as an individual, start working with these attributes that you perhaps did not realize you had, but now you are working against because you have to work to overcome. So I raise this because, like Debbie says, we all have biases. And these are biases that we have picked up, we have learned, we've been taught at the kitchen table, perhaps. In media, perhaps, if some of you are working in marketing and you're trying to pitch a product in Africa or trying to raise money for Africa, you know, picking images that portray the continent as dire, as sad, as needing help, rather than picking images that might have an image of me, someone who has been raised to be strong, to be wise, to be resourceful. Those images perhaps not as important. And so the question around diversity becomes so important. Like I said, I'm based in New York, and we just came through some elections. And if some of you may recognize those numbers, 78 million, 72 million, okay, the colors are not there, but you know, 78 million voted for what I would call inclusion, 72 million voted for kind of protection. And the question is not who is right or who is wrong. The question is who feels heard, who has a voice, whose life matters. And so I raise this again, I put those numbers in there because if we were to look at all organizations and if we were to poll perhaps even this particular group of people who have joined this call and say, are you heard? Do you feel heard in the organization? And here, I'm not talking about simple hearing as in I'm able to speak up, but it's a question of power and it's a question of using authority. It's a question of being included when certain decisions are being made, or being in the in crowd, or being able to have coffee with the right people. Are you included or are you not included? So this has been my experience that one, as an African, as a Kenyan woman, I've met a narrative that was totally alien to me, had to learn that narrative and had to learn how to manipulate myself to a successful place through, in spite of these narratives. So it behooves us as leaders, it behooves us as HR practitioners, not to assume that the norms we have in the organization are the norm. We need to look and see whose interests are these norms in place. We need to look and say, when we talk about performance management, what are we considering good? Are we considering an individual way of working as good, or are we saying a relational way of working is good? What do we put a premium on and why? So no longer can we go around sort of blindly putting in place things that we have found, but we need to question them. Someone has asked a question around AI, artificial intelligence, especially now with HR, you know, embracing artificial intelligence. How much othering, how much bias are we programming into our artificial intelligence? What are we calling good? What are we setting as the norm? So HR practitioners, I beseech thee, it is important for us to really look at our practices and really look at how the teams are composed and really look at what performance is done and really look at who we're recruiting and try and be as inclusive as we possibly can. I think I could go on talking forever, Debbie. So why don't I hand over to you?
Okay, so our aspirations. Josephine, do you want to talk about this, seeing as it's your...
Yes, I do have a lot to say about this. So if we think about ourselves as leaders, you know, how do we do it? So I'll talk first to leaders before I talk to HR practitioners in the next slide. As leaders, and maybe I could ask all of you who are on the call, on the webinar today, when you look at your telephone contacts and you look at the number, at the people that you call the most for work-related issues, so not your girlfriend or your groups, but really when you look at your workplace colleagues, who are you calling the most? Who do you speak to the most? And of that group of people, the top 4, are they all like you? Did you go to the same schools? Do you go to the same clubs? Do you have the same kind of coffee? Do you like the same kind of drinks? Are you wearing the same type of jewelry because, you know, you kind of influence each other? It's so important for us to make space for otherness. It's important for us to make space for other voices, other ideas, and to be, as Debbie has suggested, be quite intentional and purposeful about this. Are we making space? Are we, you've all heard the expression microaggressions. And microaggressions, you know, I can tell you one that I experienced along the way as I grew in my career. I would start off with a new boss, and the first thing they'd ask me is, where did you learn how to speak English so well? And in my mind, I think, oh gosh, I first have to explain how I learned English before I can actually explain how this particular program is going to have helped the organization become more effective. And you listen to these little aggressions over and over, and you start to question yourself, am I really good enough for this role? But because we know these exist, microaggressions, let us as leaders and as leaders practice micro-affirmations. Tiny acts of opening doors to opportunity, gestures of inclusion, gestures of caring, as you walk along the corridor, as you listen to a pitch, as you hear a young person putting forward an idea that you know, that idea may not get all the way, but if I attach them to this individual and this other individual, then that idea may actually see the light of day. Looking out for these things to affirm other individuals. Graceful acts of listening. So a willingness to be a catalyst for ideas, a willingness to create spaces and moments for ideas to multiply. So as leaders, really, you are called upon, if you want to be an inclusive leader, if you want to bring on board that young Kenyan girl who feels a little bit off because she's wondering what is going on in this organization, if you want to be able to bring these people on, these are some of the things that you want to be doing. And I have to say this, it's also important to call out othering. So many of us are not racist. Many of us will say, look, I am open. I have friends who are from, they have different sexual orientations or are from different races. My best friends are different genders. Yes, but this is more than just having friends or being around people who are different from you. This is actively being in my case, anti-racist, using your power well. Acknowledging, in a sense, your privilege, because sometimes many of us are privileged. If you are sitting in a leadership position, you are privileged. Be humble about your bias. I have a bias. When I walk into a room and the room is all male, and if the room is all white male, I know that I am bringing my color in with me. I am bringing my gender in with me into the room, and my shackles go up. That's a bias that I have, because I could be talking to the most friendliest and gentle group of people, but immediately I walk in with a bias. So acknowledging that bias, acknowledging that every single one of us has a bias, has learned and needs to be able to overcome this. Notice the world around you. And like I said, be sensitive to these microaggressions. People don't want to be pampered or to be given jobs simply because they're women or to be given jobs because they're Black. No, they simply want to be acknowledged as human beings. And when you find that you have power, and that power is giving you is giving you more access than somebody else, bring somebody else along with you. Because at the end of the day, we are all, we value inclusion, we value diversity, and like Debbie says, all of this is going to help our organizations be a really wonderful place. I have this vision for my organization. I want it to be the most colorful organization where everybody can bring their whole selves to work and know that they don't have to leave their Josephine behind and put on another Josephine as they enter the workplace.
You can see that Josephine and I are very passionate about this, this whole area. And because we're so passionate, we've developed a course And the purpose of the course is to create courageous culture makers out of leaders. We want you to be able to role model actively calling out and challenging racism and all those other forms of discrimination. We want you to take responsibility to act and minimize bias in organizational processes, practices, images, events, everything. And to learn that inclusivity is a journey and that it's got to continue. And part of that is learning to facilitate inclusive conversations where everyone feels psychologically safe and valued and a sense of belonging. And just all those words, psychologically safe, valued, belonging, they are challenging things to creating that space. And so we've developed a program, and we will tell you a little bit about it. It's starting in January. It's a new program, and it's going to be run virtually and face-to-face. It's called Inclusive Leadership, Harnessing the Power of Diversity. And it's for mid and senior level managers looking to reflect on their leadership culture and develop inclusive, diverse and equal working culture within their organizations. And what we intend is to build participants' knowledge around what this all means, understanding the business benefits of diversity in a complex and evolving marketplace, build their self-awareness of their own biases and impact on others, developing those skills and competencies that I mentioned earlier, the 7 competencies of inclusive leadership. And one of those is about facilitating inclusive conversations. We'll be focusing on that. And leaders will go away with a created and recorded tangible action plan for making steps to improve their organization's culture. So we're looking to build culture makers who are courageous, and we hope that you will be interested in attending the program with us. So we've got time now for a few questions. Let's have a look at some of the questions. There's quite a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm sorry if we don't get to answer yours today, but somebody's asked for the name of some CEOs who are good at this diversity game. And well, if you look on the internet, there's actually a rating of top 10 CEOs who have done really well at diversity. One of them is Satya Nadella of Microsoft, and another is Paul Pullman of Unilever. And I myself have worked with several CEOs who are really committed to this. And one of the companies I've worked for recently, the women I spoke to told me that when they're in the room with the CEO, they don't get talked over, they don't get interrupted because he just won't allow it. And so they recognized in him the ability to lead inclusive conversations, and they absolutely appreciated it. Josephine, do you want to pick a question?
Sure. This one question here, it's a chat from Luis on the back of BLM. And I'm finding out many of my Black colleagues are telling me they're fed up with white people asking them what it's like to be Black. They don't want to be the local expert on being Black, and they feel it's about time white people found this out for themselves. How do you recommend handling this sensitively? I would absolutely echo the sentiment of the people who say they're tired of being categorized. I think, how do we handle this sensitively? We are all human. We are all essentially coming into the workplace to do work. So really, it's important for us to get away from these categories and the need to have these categories. Someone asked me, can I touch your hair? And I said, no, that's rude. But I am very happy to receive a compliment about how my nice hair looks, how nice my hair looks, as well as you might be. So perhaps just stepping away from the categorization and simply being human. How are you doing today, and how are you, how is it going? That's really all that matters, because we don't need to add on to, the categorization, which I think it takes away from inclusion. Debbie?
Yeah. So another question here, as leaders start to act with positive intent to do these things that we acknowledge are challenging, they will inevitably be occasionally clumsy and perhaps received as microaggressive. How do we handle the ups and downs of the learning process? And I think this relates to what I talked about earlier about humility, having humility, and also being willing to show your vulnerability. I know leaders who have talked to their teams about the fact that they are trying to become more inclusive, and even more so involving their teams in working together to become more inclusive. That way, you can start to create an environment where you can give each other feedback. If you notice microaggressions, if you notice bias, then you can feed back to each other and help each other to develop the self-awareness and skills that you need. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. I have a question here. And this is a really good question. What specific strategies would you recommend for addressing less apparent dimensions of diversity, like neurodiversity? How do we guard against those with such dimensions of diversity feeling paradoxically excluded by an understandable initial focus on more apparent dimensions? It's a journey, really. It's an absolute journey. And this is where I'd like perhaps to talk to HR practitioners, because if you think about diversity, not necessarily in the categories that we so obviously see, sex, sexual orientation, gender, but really think about it as inclusion, as belonging, as inviting stories of belonging to the organization, as embedding, shall I say, events and occurrences of belonging in the organization, then we really start to build this organization that we really want. In some of the organizations that I've worked with, they are suggesting bringing in the creative space. So allowing people to bring music and dance and put up their art in the hallway, so that we celebrate the different dimensions that people have to bring. And you'd be so surprised. You'd be so surprised when you allow diversity and you allow inclusion in the workplace, what rich organizations we have.
Okay, so I think we've got time for one more question. There are quite a few questions actually about what if I say this because I'm trying to be inclusive and it comes across as being a microaggression, or I don't get it right. What do I do? And I think, that's such a tricky one, because that's the sort of thing that holds people back. And what I really encourage you to do, if you're not sure, is to ask someone how they experienced it, and say that, I've been trying to do this because I'm thinking it's more inclusive, but I don't want it to come across in the wrong way. And when we talk about microaggressions, these are things that make people feel a sense of discomfort, and they know they're feeling that discomfort. So, if the only way to know that is to create an environment where someone can say, or to ask them. And so it's really that courage that we need to be able to do that. Okay, so I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and please feel free to find out more about our programme if you would like to, and we wish you all the best for the rest of your days wherever you are.
Thank you everyone for joining and for your amazing questions. We'll incorporate some of this as we put together our training program later on this year.